Hello and welcome back to the Movie Memo Recaps. Today we are going to recap a 1982 movie titled Death Wish 2. Please be advised that there will be spoilers ahead. In the opening scene, we are introduced to Paul Kersey, an architect living in Los Angeles. He bids farewell to his housekeeper, Rosario, before departing to meet his lover and news reporter, Jerry Nichols. The two proceed to see Paul's daughter, Carol, who is still in a mental facility following an incident in which she was raped by muggers. The two go on a walk around town with Carol. Paul leaves them to go get some ice cream, and as he walks past a group of goons, they begin to stare at him. The men approach and run into Paul, who discovers that his wallet has been stolen. Paul pursues the men and manages to corner one of them, Jiver, in an alleyway. Jiver draws a knife, but Paul quickly disarms him. Jiver discloses that he does not have the wallet, so Paul decides to let him leave. He returns to Jerry and Carol, informing them that he may have left his wallet at home. They walk to the pier, where Jerry leaves them and head for an interview with the senator. Meanwhile, the other thugs have located Paul's address using his ID and arrive in a vehicle outside. Rosario, who is making dinner, is unaware of the peril she is about to face. One of the men grabs a crowbar, and the other goes to ring the doorbell, pretending to have a delivery for Paul. Rosario is doubtful and confronts the man, but the others rush in through the rear door, restraining a screaming Rosario. Seeing an opportunity, the men decide to assault her and gag her mouth to drown out her screams. One man, who appears to have recently been released from prison, begins to have a wild time with her while the others cheer him on. Once he's finished, the others bring her into the bedroom, where they take turns with Rosario. A few minutes later, Paul and Carol return home, but they are quickly encircled by the men, who detain Paul and knock him unconscious with the crowbar. Rosario attempts to phone the cops, but a man smashes her on the head, killing her, before fleeing the house with Carol, dragging her into a van, and depart. The men transport Carol back to their lair, unsure what to do with her. One man advises killing her because she has seen their faces. Jiver is concerned since Paul has seen his face, but Cutter assures him that white people believe everyone looks the same. One man sees a chance and starts undressing an unresponsive Carol. Jerry returns to the house and rings Paul's doorbell, waking him up. Paul answers the door, and they discover Rosario's lifeless body. One man finishes having his way with Carol, and as another begins to prepare, Carol abruptly flees, prompting the men to pursue her. She then leaps through a window and impales herself on the metal bars outside. The authorities carry Rosario's body away, and Inspector Mackenzie arrives to gather additional information about the perpetrators. Paul inquires about Carol, but the cops have heard nothing. Paul tries to recall the events, but he was struck unconscious before he could recognize any faces. The inspector is aware of Paul's family tragedy in New York and assures him that he is doing everything he can to help. He then hands Paul a glass figurine that he purchased for Carol on their day out. Just then, a cop informs Paul that they have found his daughter, and he is transported to the morgue to identify the body. Paul can't sleep now that his entire family is gone. Carol's funeral is soon held, and Paul witnesses his daughter's burial. His supervisor tells him to take some time off, but Paul says he will return shortly. He retreats to a cottage in the woods and spends his days cutting firewood to relieve tension. After a few weeks, Paul goes home and resumes work at his company, which is developing a new building. He next meets with the owner of the radio station where Jerry works and for whom he is constructing the new facility. He then sees Jerry, who invites him on a date later, but Paul is not interested. Outside, cops confront him and ask him to look at some mugshots, but Paul maintains he doesn't remember anything. He then finds his gun from its hiding place, loads it, and takes off. Paul parks and walks through the city, studying every criminal figure in an attempt to track down his daughter's killers. Later that evening, he changes into black attire and travels deep into the inner city, where he finds a motel and rents a room as a base of operations under the name Mr. Kimball. That night, Paul goes lurking but finds no one. Jerry, who had made her way into Paul's residence the night before, startles him the next morning. His gun is still out, so he discreetly hides it before she notices. After she goes, Paul calls a locksmith to change his locks. The next night, Paul decides to spin the block. He is sitting by the roadside when he notices one of the men who stole his wallet, Stomper. He notices them meeting with some other males and decides to follow them closely. The men enter an abandoned structure, and Paul puts on his gloves, ready for combat. He enters the rat-infested building with his gun pulled and discovers the men making a deal. Paul shoots one man dead, urging the others to leave and Stomper to stand his ground. With a chuckle, Paul notices Stomper's crucifix necklace and tells him he will meet Jesus shortly before killing him. He returns to his motel room and hides the gun away. He arrives home just as Jerry calls, wondering why he hasn't been returning her calls. Paul claims he was in all night but just refused to answer the phone due to telemarketers. The two then arrange for a date on Friday. Stomper's death was just reported in the press. The following night, Paul returns to his motel room and retrieves his gun, ready to begin drilling for the night. He was walking around the city when he heard screaming from an underground parking lot. Paul goes to investigate and discovers some guys bullying a couple, dragging the woman into a van. Paul charges at the men and shoots the first two dead. Another man emerges from the van, blasting, and manages to escape. Jiver, the remaining man, holds the practically naked woman at gunpoint and warns Paul to stay back. He flees, but Paul manages to shoot him in the buttocks before he gets away. Paul then notices his blood trail and sees Jiver rushing into an abandoned building. Paul takes out his gun and searches for the injured goon, who is hiding with his gun ready. He uses a distraction to draw Paul closer to him before attempting to run him over with a forklift. Paul dodges but manages to shoot Jiver dead. He flees before the cops arrive on the scene. Inspector Mackenzie is furious with the spouse because he refuses to describe the vigilante and orders his officers to detain him. He tries to elicit a description from the wife, but the husband describes Paul as a very nice citizen. The inspector goes to meet with the police commissioner about a possible vigilante on the loose but believes he will be unable to locate him. The commissioner suddenly recalls stories of a vigilante in New York, instructing the investigator to contact the department. The NYPD receives the information, and Detective Ochoa notes that Paul now lives in Los Angeles, which is where the reports are coming from. Ochoa explains that he has been keeping an eye on Paul for years and suspects he is the one. The men are concerned that if Paul is apprehended, it would be exposed that they let him go, which would result in the loss of their employment. They intend to apprehend Paul before the LAPD does and to send Ochoa to investigate and stop him if he is the vigilante. Ochoa soon travels to Los Angeles and meets with a contact, where he hears that Paul's maid and daughter have been killed. He then seeks out Jerry and enters her residence. He then informs Jerry about Paul's past in New York, including how he killed 9 people as a vigilante. He explains how Paul was seen as a hero and encouraged to leave the city, but he feels he is back in the vigilante business. He believes Paul would listen to Jerry if she ordered him to stop, and he leaves Jerry with many questions. Jerry goes to see Paul when she notices him walking in, claiming he was just out with a male buddy. Jerry tells him about Ochoa's visit and the charges, but Paul denies everything, as if he were innocent, otherwise, he would have been jailed. Jerry acknowledges this, recalling that Ochoa appeared weird. Paul then recounts a tall yarn about what happened in New York, sealing it all with a kiss, and Jerry eats it up. The next day, Ochoa phones a contact and asks him to park his car outside Paul's residence. Paul notices the car approaching but exits through a rear entrance, unaware that Ochoa is following him. He follows Paul all the way back to the inner city and witnesses him enter the motel. Paul gets changed and returns armed with 2 pistols. Paul returns to the city where he notices Cutter and 2 other criminals dancing in the park, remembering their faces from the invasion. The men don't recognize Paul, who is keeping a tight check on them. He pursues the men as they board a public bus, with Ochoa following behind. On the bus, the boys start harassing a female passenger, but Paul stays calm and keeps his distance. The men eventually get off the bus, and Paul follows them into the darkness. Ochoa pays his taxi driver to wait for him and pursues Paul on foot. Paul, with his gun drawn, approaches the men as they are meeting with some other criminals to make a deal on guns. Ochoa, who is also watching, then notices a sniper in a tree poised to take aim at Paul. Ochoa warns Paul just in time to dodge the attack, but the criminals are aware. Ochoa kills the sniper before he and Paul engage in a shootout. Unfortunately, Ochoa is shot down in a flurry of gunfire. Paul shoots and kills Cutter and the 2 goons before shooting the arms dealer, who drives off a cliff and dies. The man who shot Ochoa, however, escapes the scene. Paul walks over to Ochoa, amazed that he is there to help. Ochoa then orders Paul to avenge him before dying. Paul then flees the site before cops arrive in large numbers and discover the deaths. 1 goon is still fighting for his life, and Mackenzie demands to know who killed Ochoa. The goon reveals the man's identity as Charles Wilson before passing away himself. The next day, Paul goes to Jerry's radio station and discovers that the cops are arranging a large raid to get Charles. He then acquires an outdated police scanner from one of Jerry's colleagues. Paul listens closely to the scanner till he overhears the cops planning for their operation. Paul arrives at the area and observes the cops planning their raid and Charles entering a building. Paul parks behind the building and then ascends to the roof. He gains entrance to the building where Charles is and draws his gun, preparing to kill him. He approaches the room where Charles is hiding, but Charles, under the influence of narcotics, slashes Paul's arm and escapes. Out on the street, cops attempt to tackle Charles, but he is too high and fights them off until the entire precinct arrives to hold him down. Paul dresses his wound in his motel, gets dressed, and heads home. Jerry returns shortly after, showing him the newspaper that reported Ochoa's death and the arrest of the killer. Jerry leaves to get ready for their date later. At Charles's trial, the court judges him criminally insane and commits him to a mental facility. Jerry is writing an article about the doctor who is treating Charles, so Paul asks if he can join her for the interview. While there, Paul requests to go to the men's room but instead enters the doctor's locker room, where he discovers a coat with an ID attached. He grabs the ID and creates a fake one for himself. He then takes Jerry out on a date and asks her to marry him, to which she agrees. After the wedding, he wants to take her on a vacation, which she is looking forward to. The following night, Paul prepared to carry out his plan. He drives over to the hospital, disguised as a doctor, and asks for directions to Charles's room. He then persuades an orderly to let him through and directs him to Charles's room. The orderly then takes Charles and leaves him alone in the room with Paul. Paul grabs his gun, but Charles disarms him. When Charles pulls a shank, stabbing Paul several times, the two start fighting. Paul fights back, forcing Charles's arm to become stuck in a high-voltage panel, and Paul shocks him to death. Paul then comes face to face with the orderly, who recognized him from Carol's murder report. He then gives Paul a 3-minute head start before sounding the alarm. Paul hurriedly returns to his motel room to address his injuries. Meanwhile, Jerry arrives at his residence, where she discovers that Paul created a fake doctor's ID and learns about Charles's death. She removes her engagement ring and leaves Paul, who arrives home shortly after. Months later, Paul attends a presentation on his radio station design facility. The owner asks him to a launch party but questions why Paul is always absent in the evenings and never answers the phone. When Paul accepts the invitation, he says, "What else would I do?" Paul returns to the streets at night to continue his killing spree. Thanks for watching. If you are new, don't forget to subscribe for more of these recaps. Until next time, have a nice day.